I'm Meg Wilcox. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Journalism and a member of the MRFA. And joining me is Marc Schroeder. He is the Advocacy Officer for the MRFA and a member of the executive. And Marc, you've been crunching some numbers. Today, we're talking revenues.
Yes, that's right. So following on our recent discussion about expenses and surplus, let's take a closer look at revenues. What I've done here, again, this data comes from the MRU annual reports that are published yearly on our website. And here I've shown a breakdown of some of the key sources of operating revenue for the institution. Not all revenues are shown here, so there are some smaller ticket items like investment income and so on that are left off. But these are the significant ones I think faculty need to keep an eye on. Essentially, there are two main sources of oxygen for the institution. There's the operating grant that we receive from the provincial government, so public money to support our academic function. And then, of course, there is student tuition and fees. There's a third category that includes all kinds of smaller sources of income, as well as sales of services and products from our various ancillary business functions and so on. But I want to start by taking a look at tuition and fees, which looks fairly flat from 2012 onwards. And remember, these are in thousands of dollars, and they're constant $2,009. So I've adjusted for inflation. Tuition looks flat here. But in fact, before up to 2015, it's important for listeners to remember that we were subject to tuition regulation in the province in these years. So tuition couldn't really increase at a rate overall for the institution in aggregate faster than inflation. And the NDP government that came in 2015 instituted a tuition freeze, except that you would expect then that our numbers would slowly be eaten away at. But in fact, remember that this is around the same time that the institution chose to focus on enrollment growth, while also keeping spending on our instruction function constrained. And so that's why we're not seeing, I think, in my opinion, a big inflationary decrease over time. Enrollments are going up here. In more recent years, of course, I'm sure our listeners will remember that the current government has allowed tuitions to increase from 2019 onwards by up to 7% a year in aggregate for the institution. Mm-hmm. But most of that is not reflected here based on the annual reports that have been released publicly so far. The other thing we want to take a look at is the value of our operating grant fluctuating over time. We can see the effects of the large 2013 cut here. In 2015, we started getting inflationary increases to our operating grant. And yet the grant still goes up for a few reasons. We were getting, in some years anyway, lights on money topped up so that buildings such as our new library and learning center, at least in some years, had some additional corresponding funding coming online. And in response to the tuition freeze, the government of the day also gave our operating grant an additional inflationary backfill. So the money that we would have been able to charge in additional tuition was instead added by the government to our base operating grant. And so we actually see that number come up a little bit. And again, in recent years, since 2019, the beginning of a round of year-over-year cutting, which is going to get much steeper. It's going to be a much steeper decline once the most recent few budgets show up in the graph. If you take those two numbers and add them together, operating grant plus tuition and fees, you get what I think of as essentially our bread and butter revenue to support our core academic teaching and research function. And you can see how that compares to our overall revenues, all sources included. And just to help put this in perspective for our listeners, what I've done here is I've shown expenses over the recent years in stacked form by function, and I've superimposed upon that our total revenues year by year, and also our base operating grant plus our tuition and fees as a large component of our overall revenues. And again, what we see here is this general decline year over year in support for the instruction function, even while, in fact, the general trend, even with the most recent rounds of cutting beginning, is an operating grant and tuition revenue that show a slight increase.
So what does this mean for the membership?
I think what it means for the membership is that our university administration will often look to the instruction function, which is credit instruction and non-sponsored research. The evidence is clear. They tend to look at that over and over again as a source that they can draw from, a well that they can keep returning to try to deal with, to try to alleviate budget pressures within the institution. The second big takeaway for our members is that while we have to question the institution's internal prioritization and what they choose to focus on and what they choose to devalue, we also have to take very seriously the broader political threat to our operating grant that is becoming more and more severe as we weather more and more years of continual cutting to that source of funding.